Okay, well, welcome everybody. This is Liz Stockenborg. I'm with the Brownwood Birders, and I am so happy that Hilary Flower has agreed to do an encore presentation of her talk about the bird that saved itself, the Everglade Snail Kite story. We're going to be recording this, as I said, and we'll save the questions till afterwards. But just so you know a little bit about Hilary, she's a scientist and author. She is going to talk about the snail kite, which is an endangered bird that adapted to invasive prey and shifting habitats. She's going to talk about ecology, personal journey, and hope, and offer fresh insight into how species survive and flourish in a changing world. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it on over to Hilary. And thank you so much, Hilary. Welcome.
Hi. Hello, Liz. Thank you so much. And hello to the Brownwood Birders. I'm so glad to see you all again. I really loved coming out in April and getting to know you all. I'm excited to talk to you all about the Everglade Snail Kite. My book on this topic came out in March, and it's been really fun to get to have these conversations. So definitely do put questions in the chat and we can chat at the end. So I probably don't need to tell most of you what they look like, but just to be complete. Everglade snail kites are in the hawk family. So especially the females at first glance might look like a hawk, but they have this very prominent white bar at the base of their tail. And the females are brown and cream. And the males are this gorgeous slate gray, and they also have the white bar at the base of their tail. And the skin near their bill and their feet and toes are bright orange. And Liz shared with me a photo of the snail kite that she took at Emeralda Marsh, and she looked up information on it. So I love that so many of you have beautiful photos of snail kites from your nearby wetlands. So this one uh, was born at Lake Okeechobee. That's the beauty of banding birds, is you get to find out stuff about them. It was soon after seen at Lake Toho. It spent a couple years up at Payne's Prairie. That place was really popping for a while. I bet a lot of you saw them up there. It had a failed nesting attempt, and then it went to Loxahatchee Slough. And so we get to just follow birds all around based on people like Liz spotting them and reporting them. So this is a gorgeous female. You can see the white eyebrow. You can see the bright red eyes. She's just gorgeous. So the Everglade snail kite, it's got snail right in its name. And that's because it's a specialist predator, which means it specializes in one thing. And a lot of you know that, for instance, osprey specialize in fish, right? They're not picky about what kind of fish, but they will go after fish. Snail kites, it's not just snails in general, it's the apple snail. That is their one prey item. And they have a native apple snail. There's only one native one in Florida. It's called Palmacia pallidosa. And it's got those white pearl-like eggs that it lays on wetland plants. And when it's available, snail kites will eat these apple snails 99.4%. Like basically, it's all they eat. And the beauty of having one thing that you eat is that you can evolutionarily adapt to eat that one thing and to be better at eating that one thing than anything else. So snail kites have adapted to eat these freshwater apple snails by, for one thing, having eagle eyes. They are good at spotting them. They fly like they're not even looking where they're going. They're just looking straight down into the water. And then when they spot a snail, they will grab it with their extra long toes and extra long talons that evolved to wrap around the freshwater apple snails that are kind of like golf balls. And they grab them, they take them up to a perch, and that's when their bill comes into play. So I think of their bill as like a can opener because it's just thin enough to reach in and pop off the operculum. That's like the lid that the snail can close and hide behind, but the snail kite can peel it off, toss it away, and then the snail itself, the flesh of the snail, adheres to the hard shell with this one muscle around the inside bend of their shell. And so, in order to pull the snail's flesh out, the snail kite has a bill that is curved the exact right amount to reach around that bend and snip that muscle that holds the flesh in. And then, boom, they've got lunch. So they are perfectly evolved for this one kind of prey. And so the habitat that they want is habitat that supports apple snails, but it's not enough that there be a lot of apple snails. They have to be able to see them. So they need marshes that are open, that there's vegetation. It's not just open water, because they need the snails to be able to crawl up vegetation to breathe near the surface. That's where they can see them, like in this sketch that I made for you. But there also needs to be I think of it as a window of clear water that's not obstructed by other vegetation, so that the snail kite can spot the snail, and then boom, they get in there and they grab them. So they characteristically would find their prey in these fragrant water lily marshes. And you can see that there's some spike rush for them to climb up. And this is a spike rush marsh. These are from the Everglades. So this is prime snail kite habitat. And so that's for foraging. For nesting, they like to have trees like cypress trees that are near marsh so that they can forage really easily and then bring their snails back to their young in these trees. And the nest needs to be in a tree that is under that has at least a meter of water underneath it. And that's true also for where they like to roost. And the reason for that is gators. So it is true that sometimes gators go up into their nests and take their young or their eggs, which is unfortunate. But having gators below their nest is a net benefit to snail kites because it keeps out other land predators like raccoons. So they need to have water under their nest and good foraging nearby. And that's what a lot of Florida was like before humans came along, and especially before Americans came along and started draining it. And those characteristics of good snail kite habitat were good habitat for wading birds and amphibians and snakes and the whole ecosystem of the Everglades. So what was good for the snail kite was good for the ecosystem in general. And so this is a version of their pre-drainage habitat. So really they had most of Florida, pretty much any freshwater wetland that had these apple snails was good habitat for them. And here's the villages. I just added that today for you to my map. And so really Florida was a factory for making Everglade snail kites for the millennia. But then, spoiler alert, we did start to drain it. And the Everglades, which is mainly down here, which was their prime habitat, that's why they're called Everglade snail kites, because that was their prime habitat, even though they were not restricted to it. In fact, they nested all the way up in the panhandle. But the Everglades with drainage diminished in size by 50%, which is really a lot. And the snail kite habitat restricted to now they're using 9% of their historical range. So actually that was even by the 80s. They were down to only 9% of their historical range. So they've they've got a challenge ahead of them, and they've been close to extinction many times. In fact, in the middle of the 20th century, and some of you were here in Florida at the time, there were 25 to 100 snail kites. And that was before we were really doing any proper research on them. So, what that tells me is that we may have lost snail kites before we even started paying attention to them. But we did start paying attention to them. And this is one of my favorite researchers. She plays a big role in the book. I loved getting to know her. Jean Takakawa. She was based in Loxahatchee Refuge. And there was a drought in 1981 where all of a sudden snail kites disappeared from their normal habitat. They were not in the Everglades. And the question was, where did they go? And we were just talking before we started the meeting about eBird. I know a lot of you all use eBird, which is amazing citizen science in action. But citizen science was not even a word in the 80s. And Jean Takakawa decided to start getting people in the general public to help her find snail kites. So she called it a kite sighting hotline. And this is an example from one of the newspapers. She put it out on blast, radio, newspapers, tried to get the general public to let her know when they saw a snail kite. And she would ask them a bunch of questions to verify. And when she could, she would go out there herself to verify. And what she figured out was that it was a mass dispersal event. So these snail kites went in all directions in Florida looking for their snails. And what she learned about them as a result is that they're nomads. So there's birds that are migratory, right? They come into your area seasonally and then they go out. A lot of them are not here now. The swallowtail kites are about to head back to South America. And then there are some birds that live in a given area year round. But then nomads are birds where their habitat is it's a moving target. And so for snail kites, their habitat is where are the apple snails? And that's where they would be. And this drought was a wonderful way of learning about that. So because of the drought, so these dark gray areas are parts of their kind of their prime nesting habitat in the 80s. And it became their critical habitat designated as part of their protection as endangered species. So that's their prime habitat. But in 1981, these places, these wetlands dried up. So their native apple snail was gone. And so she started trying to keep a map of where did they end up. And in the process of finding snails, a lot of the snail kites did starve. So their drought reduced their population that year by 50%. So it was really deadly. And so all of the wetlands where snail kites did survive, she called emergency wetlands. And the idea was, yeah, these nesting strongholds that I've highlighted here in dark gray, they were necessary for the snail kite to survive as a species, but then so were these emergency wetlands, because this is how the other half of the snail kites survived that really deadly drought. And what surprised her was that these were not wetlands that you and I would have chosen for our precious snail kites. They were very urban, human-dominated, sometimes very small wetlands. They could be urban canals, retention ponds, roadside ditches, agricultural ditches and canals, wetlands that we might think of as low quality, but they were how the snail kites survived the drought with their very clever adaptability. So one of their emergency wetlands was an abandoned mining pit. So, our driveways and some paths and roads are made of shell rock. and that gets excavated from bedrock by like digging a deep hole in the ground, whoops, and putting the overburden right next to that deep ditch and then removing the bedrock. So what you get is these kind of linear canals and then linear islands of the overburden. So one of the places where Gene Takakawa found snail kites was this abandoned mining pit. And you can kind of see that those overburden islands, the spoil islands, are covered with trees. By the 1980s, the mine was abandoned in the 60s, and they were then covered with Brazilian pepper. So this is an abandoned mining pit, deep water, which is not really a Florida thing, and then these islands of Brazilian pepper. So you would think, well, this is very, very low quality. So she heard that there were snail kites from someone who called the refuge. She went there to check it out, and she saw them coming into roost. And so here's actually a male that she saw. They're coming into roost, and another one comes in, and another one, and she starts counting them. So that's 10, 11, 12, 100, 101. Like they just kept coming. And she just couldn't keep counting them. And she just sat back and watched them come into roost in this kind of crazy wetland. And in fact, you can see this is the note she put on the back of this photo of her in a canoe going out on those weird canals. She called it the Palm Beach County landfill site. And that's because in addition to being an abandoned mining pit, it was about to become a landfill. It had been earmarked to be a solid waste property for Palm Beach County. So she got friends to come out, and they stationed themselves around this roost. And in the evening, they started counting because they wanted to see, well, how many snail kites are coming into roost here. And they counted 372 snail kites. This was actually a later drought. This was in 1985. It was a new drought. She started the snail kite hotline again. And 372 kites came to nest in this, to roost in this one roost. And that number is especially remarkable when you find that that year only 400 snail kites survived. So this, what I think of as a garbage wetland, is how the snail kites survived the drought of 1985. So these emergency wetlands were extremely important, and even ones we would not have chosen for them. And so one of the mysteries for her was, you can kind of see there's all kinds of algae on the canal here. This is not the habitat where the freshwater snails would be, or where they'd be visible, right? Because you don't have a window here to look in and find a snail. So she knew that, and she didn't see any snails. So she knew that they were roosting here, but not foraging here. And she kept seeing that they were coming in from the west. And this is so crazy. So this was a year when more than half of the snail kites did not survive. But in this one kind of garbage wetland, this male snail kite that she spotted was nesting. And she watched as a fledgling kind of was flying around the nest. So it was truly a miracle roost with a miracle nest. But the mystery was, where are they coming from? Where are they foraging during the day if they're roosting here at night? So here's the roost. Let me move this out of my way. Okay, so here's the roost, and they were coming in from the west, and that was a water catchment area. So here's some of the data of them coming in to roost from this water catchment area. And some of you may be familiar with it. It became a preserve. It is now called Grassy Waters Preserve. And it's preserved in part because it's the drinking water for West Palm Beach. And it's still to this day is that perfect snail kite habitat. It's the one place today where I was able to see a lot of the native apple snail, very much in abundance. You could see their eggs, and snail kites are still feasting on their native apple snail there. Many of you know that we have an invasive apple snail now, which turns out it's a good thing because the native apple snail has declined. The Other than Grassy Waters Preserve, the snail kite is really not relying on the native apple snail anywhere in Florida. It's really relying on this invasive snail, and we can talk more about that. So they started nesting in grassy waters. It's an amazing, beautiful wetland environment. It's part of the historical Everglades. And right next door is what used to be that abandoned mining pit. And I mentioned that she called it the landfill site because it was about to become a solid waste authority. And what Palm Beach County did, thanks to Jean Takikawa, she took them out there, she showed them the roost, they made it into a preserve. So there's a waste to energy plant, there's a landfill, and yet there's this miracle roost for snail kites preserved as is right where it was in the 1980s. And I mentioned before that what's good for snail kites is good for the wading birds. That miracle roost is also a miracle rookery for wading birds. So thousands and thousands of wading birds have hatched and flown and fledged from this kind of crazy wetland. So I got to see it. I went out. This is one of the people from the Solid Waste Authority, and he pointed out the miracle roost. You can see a lot of wading birds nesting. And he said, yep, that's exactly where Jean Takikawa counted 372 snail kites in the 1980s. So the Solid Waste Authority of Palm Beach County is still doing snail kite counts and taking care of this crazy wetland. He said actually that they are not allowed to do anything about the deep water or about the Brazilian pepper on the islands because, it's working. And this is just an example of an egret nesting in Brazilian pepper. Not my choice for egrets, but they need somewhere to nest. This is snail kites coming into roost in 2019. So they are still going strong there. This was a night when they counted 196 snail kites coming in. So it's still a really big deal to them. So one of the things I learned about snail kites writing this book and kind of following them around Florida, because I'm based in the Tampa Bay area, and I'm used to like my urban area and then going down to the Everglades, and it's pristine, right? And what the snail kites were telling me, following them and learning about their nomad adaptation, was that yes, they do need pristine wetlands. This is a photo I took in grassy waters. They need the pristine Everglades, but they also need the drastically altered wetlands. We need to make room for them in some of our man-made wetlands because during a drought, these like deep ditches that they dug as part of the mining operation, well, they have deep enough water that they still have water to keep that roost safe even during a drought. So they would not have needed that in the historical version of Florida, but they do need it now. And snail kites can teach us that. So this is just another example of a wetland that I never expected to find myself in. This is, many of you know that there are a lot of ranches in Central Florida. This is a cattle ranch where they flooded it. So it was a pasture. They flooded it for duck hunting. And the invasive snail, many of you have seen its eggs. They look very different from the large pearl-sized eggs that are kind of white of the native apple snail. The invasive apple snail eggs, there's like thousands of them. They're really tiny and it looks like pink bubble gum. And the snail shells can be really large, but they love altered wetlands. And so, as the native snail began to decline in the Everglades, just coincidentally, the timing was such that this invasive snail started taking off in our impacted wetlands. So, this farmer, this rancher, flooded his pasture. The invasive snail took off. And this was the biggest snail kite nesting spot, this cattle ranch in a recent year. Let's see, it was 2023. It was the second biggest kite nesting super site in 2023. So that is snail kites telling us that they need us to make room for them in our man-made wetlands, even cattle ranches. And this is so crazy. So snail kites are so adaptive. You would think, I would think, that if there's duck hunters, but there's nesting snail kites, you have to call off the hunting, right? Get the guns out of there. There's an endangered species. But the snail kites were like, no. So what the snail kites would do when a duck hunter would walk out to go get their duck after they shot it, the walking person walking through the water would kind of cause the snails to roll up, and the snail kites could catch them. So the snail kites loved it. Sometimes they would hang out on the duck blind. And then when a hunter went out to get their duck, the snail kite would follow behind them and get the snails. So duck hunting was actually partly why it was such a great nesting year for snail kites that year. So they're just full of surprises. Just one other one I wanted to mention really quick. A stormwater treatment area. A lot of you all know that the Everglades agricultural area, its water runs off into the Everglades, but it's intercepted and cleaned first at these stormwater treatment areas, which are basically man-made wetlands. They may have a lot of cattail in them. It's to clean the water, right? And so in 2013, the invasive snail took off so intensely at this stormwater treatment area that the snails ate all of the vegetation. It was a snail apocalypse, according to Eric Crawford, who told me the story. But by the same token, it was great for snail kites. So it was the third highest snail kite nesting area in 2013. So here's Eric had just, put his hand down amidst the cattail, and he could pull up a whole, shirt full of these invasive snails. And you can see the egg clutches were literally weighing down the cattail. They were so numerous. So to me, that's just a wild story. So we talked early on about banding. And that can tell us things that the snail kites need us to know. And so I really started to think about, well, what would snail kites tell us if they could speak? And one of the things I figured out watching them and being dragged around the state into, a landfill wetland and a pasture was that they need pristine wetlands and they need altered wetlands, and they can share space with human activities if we make room for them. And to get a more fine-tuned response from them, I think of ARCI as kind of the bird version of the Lorax. The Lorax speaks for the trees. Well, Ken Meyer and Gina Kent of the Avian Research and Conservation Institute, I really think that they speak for imperiled birds. Many of you know that they banned and track swallowtail kites, and they also do that with snail kites. And so I got to go out with Gina Kent, who is a legend. and try to uh, trap snail kites for her to put a little backpack for GPS on the back of a kite so that she could track it as it moved off into the rest of its life. And so this is so Gina Kent kind of pulls up with her kayak to this tree, and she could see that Snail Kite had been using it, and she put out a trail of snails to attract the kite and went about trapping it. So when we finally were able to trap a snail kite, she took all these measurements and was extremely careful with the kite, and she put a little backpack on it. And so these three maps are some of the results from ARCI over the years. So they have tracked 45 snail kites since 2007. And these are three different time slices through their tracking data of snail kites. So let's look at this first one. This is from 2012 to 2015. It was different snail kites. And you can see what wetlands they were using. Some of them may have been close to the villages, in fact. For the most part, they're in the Everglades and near the western marshes of Lake Okeechobee, but they're starting to go up to Lake Toho even then, back in 2012, and that's because of the invasive snail. This is 2016 to 2020. So looking back and forth, you can see that it's almost like they're starting to empty out of the Everglades and pour into the central and northern part of the state. So this is Lake Toho, Lake Kissimmee. They're going up the St. Johns River. They're in Palm Beach County. Here's their Miracle Roost. And so as the native snail declined and the invasive snail began to take off in impacted wetlands, the snail kites followed them. So this is 2021 to 2025. They've almost entirely left the Everglades behind, and they're up as far north as Paynes Prairie. That was during the time when Paynes Prairie was a hotspot. And why was it a hotspot? Hurricanes filled it up with water, and the invasive snail took off. So we're really looking at a period of time in the last couple decades when snail kites have become refugees from the Everglades. They're the Everglades snail kite, but they're really not able to use the Everglades anymore. We have damaged the water cycles to the extent that the native apple snail is really not available in enough abundance. So in 2012, which is the same time period as this map, the Everglades restoration progress got an F. And that was because the snail kites were experiencing already near irreversible damage. The native apple snail population had gone down. The hydrology was out of whack. Everglades restoration was getting a wake-up call from the snail kite. And so they got an F. And you might think that they would take that as a warning, but it continued to degrade. And the way I think of it, and part of the reason I wanted to show you that map of the emergency wetlands, is I think that our current condition of them in central and northern Florida and not in the Everglades is very much like the emergency wetlands that they used in the 80s due to droughts. So you could say that they are in an extended emergency the way that the Everglades currently is. So I think that the snail kites, as our ARCI is speaking for them by allowing them to show us the wetlands that they are using and the ones that they are named for and are not able to use, they're telling us that there's an emergency in the Everglades. And remember, what's good for snail kites is good for the wading birds. So wading birds and amphibians and reptiles, the whole ecosystem of the Everglades is in trouble if the snail kite cannot use it. Um, so um, the this is I want to talk to you briefly, and I'm wrapping up, I promise, about Water Conservation Area 3A. So 3A is just north of Tamiami Trail, and then just south of that is the Everglades National Park. So here's Tamiami Trail right here, and then north of that is 3A, south of that is the park. And 3A is being kept too deep, and the Everglades National Park is not getting enough water. And so if the Everglades National Park's not getting enough water, then you don't have enough apple snails, you don't have happy wading birds either. And 3A is also the homeland for the Miccosukee tribe. And as early as the 90s, when the water management for 3A changed and it started getting kept too deep, deer started drowning. And the tree islands that the Miccosukee tribe considered their home, that many of them were born on, started to drown. You have drowning tree islands, drowning deer, and dwindling snail kites. This is Miccosukee elder Michael Frank. These are chickees that he built on his family's tree island, and he had to build boardwalks because, as you can see, it's filling up with water. So in 2005, the Miccosukee tribe sued the American government saying, okay, if you're not concerned with 3A drowning our tree islands, maybe you'll be concerned about this invasive species. So they sued the American government and the Fish and Wildlife Service. It was fascinating to read their response. So they went one by one through the complaints about the water management that the Miccosukee were making. And they agreed. They said, yes, this is a problem. It will continue to impact snail kites, but, and then they pulled the rug out. They said, this is reversible with improved hydrologic conditions. So no permanent loss of habitat is expected. So that was in 2005. And you can see what's happened in the last 2 decades since then. So if it's reversible, it's time for them to reverse it and start prioritizing the habitat and the Miccosukee homeland over the human agendas that cause us to keep 3A too deep. And also there's a similar problem in Lake Okeechobee. It's being kept too deep. So what would snail kites tell us if they could speak? And thanks to ARCI, we have some very good insights from them. I think they would say that the Everglades is hurting and that we need to alleviate the overly deep water in 3A so they can all come home. And Lake Okeechobee too. So they've been saving themselves. They're nomads, right? They'll go where the snails are. They've even left the Everglades. They've left their original snail and now they've tethered their fate to this invasive snail. They are adapting as fast as they can, but they're still vulnerable. They need a healthy Everglades. They need help from us. I didn't test this first, so let's see if this video will show. Yeah. So this is the snail kite that we trapped. This is Gina Kent letting it go. There it goes. Ah, I'll never get over that experience. Stunning. And we've been following Roma Red, that snail kite, ever since. So I want to wrap up there, and I want to get a chance to hear from you all and maybe answer some questions, hear your comments. Hopefully you've put some in the chat, and Liz and I will go through them. I wanted to just very briefly plug my book. I do hope you will read it. On my website, which is hilaryflowerauthor.com, I've got book group discussion questions. I can also come to your book group if you would like. And there's a guide on how to spot a snail kite with ID tips that Gina Kent worked on with me. And if you scan this QR code, it just takes you to the UPF website, and you can use this code to get an $8 discount on the books. And I hope that you consider reading my book. And with that, I believe I will stop sharing. So scan the QR code if you want to, and then we'll look at the chat. So thank you for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Hilary. That was so interesting. And if you have suggestions about what we can do to help get the Everglades back to where it should be, that would be great. And I'd mentioned also to you that Gina Kent is actually speaking to our group next month. So nice plug for her. In the meantime, I'm just going to stop the recording.